Case number 1. Tristan Beaudette. On the morning of June 22, 2018, the quiet of Malibu Creek State Park was shattered by a single high-velocity gunshot. Tristan Beaudette, a 35-year-old research scientist, was sleeping in his tent alongside his two young daughters, ages 2 and 4. They were at Site 51, a popular spot in a park often referred to as the Yosemite of Southern California. Tristan was a brilliant chemist, a devoted father, and a man who lived for the outdoors. This trip was meant to be a final, peaceful getaway before the family relocated from Irvine to Northern California for new job opportunities. His wife, Erica Wu, a doctor, had stayed home to study for an upcoming medical exam, trusting that her husband and daughters were safe in what was considered one of the most secure campgrounds in the state. At exactly 4:44 a.m., a bullet tore through the fabric of the tent. It was a precision shot that struck Tristan in the head while he was in a deep sleep. He died instantly. His two little girls were lying only inches away from him. While they were not physically hit by the bullet, they were left in the pitch-black tent, covered in their father's blood, crying out for help. Tristan's brother-in-law, Scott McCurdy, was camping in a separate tent nearby. He was awakened by what he described as several loud pops or cracks that he initially mistook for fireworks. It wasn't until he heard the frantic cries of the children that he rushed to the tent and discovered the gruesome scene. By the time emergency responders arrived at 5:21 a.m., there was nothing they could do. Tristan Beaudette was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation that followed revealed a terrifying reality. Tristan Beaudette was not the first victim of a sniper in Malibu Creek State Park. As detectives began to dig into local records, they found a disturbing pattern of unsolved shootings dating back nearly 2 years. Since November 2016, there had been at least 7 documented incidents of mysterious gunfire in the area. One of the earliest cases involved a man named James Rogers, who was sleeping in a hammock in the park when he was struck in the arm by birdshot. Other reports included multiple motorists driving along the winding Las Virgenes Road who had their vehicles struck by bullets. Just 4 days before Tristan was killed, a man driving a white Tesla reported that a bullet had narrowly missed his head, smashing through his windshield. Public outrage surged as it became clear that the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and California State Parks officials were aware of these shootings but had failed to warn the public. They had kept the park open and allowed families like the Beaudettes to camp there without any knowledge that an active shooter, later dubbed the Malibu Sniper, was preying on people in the early morning hours. This failure to warn would later lead to significant legal battles and lawsuits from the Beaudette family and even from within the police department itself. The hunt for the killer lasted 4 months. Authorities were looking for a survivalist, someone who knew the rugged, mountainous terrain well enough to move unseen in the dark. In October 2018, a breakthrough occurred. A series of burglaries at local community centers in the Las Virgenes Water District caught the attention of investigators. Vending machines had been broken into, and food was stolen. Detectives tracked fresh boot prints through a steep, brush-heavy ravine. On October 10, 2018, they spotted a man on a ridgeline dressed in dark clothing and a mask, carrying a rifle in his backpack. The man was Anthony Rauda, a 42-year-old drifter with a long criminal history involving explosives and weapons violations. Rauda had been living off the grid in the Malibu Hills, sleeping in makeshift camps and stealing food to survive. Ballistics testing confirmed the investigators' worst fears. The rifle found in Rauda's backpack was the same weapon used to kill Tristan Beaudette. Furthermore, the timing of his crimes was consistent. He almost always struck between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., the exact window when Tristan was murdered. During the trial, the prosecution presented a chilling portrait of Rauda. They described him as a calculated predator who targeted unsuspecting campers and drivers for sport. He didn't have a personal vendetta against Tristan. He simply viewed the park as his private hunting ground.
One of the most heartbreaking moments of the trial was the testimony regarding Tristan's youngest daughter. The prosecutor revealed that when she was found, her leggings were completely soaked in her father's blood. Rauda, for his part, showed absolutely no remorse. He frequently disrupted court proceedings, at one point having to be wheeled into the courtroom in a restraint chair wearing a spit mask because of his combative behavior. In May 2023, the jury delivered their verdict. Although the prosecution pushed for first-degree murder, Rauda was convicted of second-degree murder for the death of Tristan Beaudette. The jury found that while he had fired into the tent with the intent to kill, there wasn't enough evidence of specific premeditation for Tristan himself. However, he was also convicted on 3 counts of attempted murder, including the attempted murder of the 2 girls in the tent, and 5 counts of commercial burglary. In June 2023, the judge sentenced Rauda to 119 years to life in prison. The judge called the crime cold-blooded and senseless, ensuring that Rauda would never again walk free. For the Beaudette family, the sentence provided a measure of justice, but the trauma of that night in Malibu Creek remains. Tristan's widow, Erica Wu, told the court that she now has to explain to her daughters why their sanctuary in nature became the site of their father's murder. The case remains a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most peaceful-looking places and the devastating consequences of administrative silence in the face of a known threat.
Case number 2. Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Heather Goose, and Doris Denise Milner. On June 12, 1977, more than 100 Girl Scouts from across Oklahoma arrived at Camp Scott in Mayes County for a highly anticipated 2-week summer session. Among the new arrivals were 3 young girls from Broken Arrow who were sharing a tent for the first time: 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Heather Goose, and 10-year-old Doris Denise Milner. The girls were assigned to Tent 8 in the Kiowa unit. This unit was notorious among frequent campers for being the most isolated area of the grounds, located at the far end of a trail and partially obscured by the camp shower house. Tent 8 specifically sat on a wooden platform approximately 100 yards away from the nearest counselor's tent, making it a vulnerable target for anyone watching from the surrounding woods. The first day of camp was filled with the usual excitement of settling into a new environment, but the mood shifted as a severe thunderstorm rolled through the Ozark foothills that evening. The heavy rain and rolling thunder provided a natural cover for what was about to occur. The girls spent their final hours writing letters to their parents and arranging their sleeping bags before falling asleep. At some point during the early morning hours of June 13th, an intruder silently entered Tent 8. Despite the proximity of other tents in the Kiowa unit, the rhythmic sound of the heavy rain on the canvas tents drowned out any signs of a struggle. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that a girl in a neighboring unit reported hearing a sharp, high-pitched scream, followed by another camper hearing a cry of "Mama, Mama." A camp counselor also reported hearing a guttural moaning sound coming from the direction of the main road, but she assumed it was a local animal and did not investigate further. The horrific discovery was made at approximately 6 a.m. A counselor on her way to the showers spotted a dark shape on the trail about 150 yards away from the Kiowa unit. As she drew closer, she realized she was looking at a sleeping bag. Inside and around it were the bodies of Lori, Michelle, and Denise. The scene was devastating. All 3 girls had been brutally assaulted, beaten, and killed. Autopsies later determined that Lori and Michelle died from blunt force head trauma, likely delivered by a heavy object, while Denise had been strangled after suffering a massive blow to her head. The killer had moved the bodies from Tent 8 to the trail in an apparent attempt to distance the crime from the campsite, or perhaps as a final act of taunting the camp staff. As investigators processed the scene, they found several chilling pieces of evidence that pointed to a premeditated and calculated killer. A large red plastic flashlight was found resting on top of the girls' bodies. Upon inspection, detectives found that a piece of a heavy-duty garbage bag had been carefully taped over the lens to dim the light, and a newspaper had been stuffed inside the casing to prevent the batteries from rattling. This suggested the killer was someone who knew how to move through the woods in total silence. Furthermore, a footprint from a size 9.5 shoe was found in the blood inside Tent 8, along with several hairs that did not belong to the victims. The investigation quickly centered on Jean Leroy Hart, a local man who had been a star athlete in high school but had since become a convicted rapist and kidnapper. Most significantly, Hart had escaped from the Mays County Jail 4 years ago and had been living as a fugitive in the rugged caves and hills surrounding the camp. Hart was a member of the Cherokee Nation and possessed expert survivalist skills, which allowed him to evade a massive 10-month manhunt that involved hundreds of officers and tracking dogs. He was finally captured in April 1978 in a remote cabin located deep in the woods. The trial of Jean Leroy Hart began in 1979 and became a flashpoint for racial and social tension in Oklahoma. The prosecution presented physical evidence, including the tape used on the flashlight, which they claimed matched a roll of tape found in a cave where Hart had been hiding. They also pointed to the fact that the newspaper stuffed in the flashlight was a local edition from an area where Hart had ties. However, the defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the local sheriff's office was under immense pressure to solve the case, leading them to frame a known fugitive. The defense also highlighted the lack of direct eyewitnesses and the contamination of the crime scene by early responders. After hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict that stunned the state. Jean Leroy Hart was found not guilty of the murders. While he was acquitted of the Girl Scout killings, he was immediately returned to prison to serve out the remaining 300-plus years of his previous sentences for rape and kidnapping. Just 2 months after the trial ended, Hart collapsed and died of a heart attack while exercising in the prison yard. For decades, the case remained one of the most famous cold cases in American history, leaving the families of the 3 girls without legal closure. However, in 2022, Mays County Sheriff Mike Reed announced that new advanced DNA testing had been conducted on the remaining evidence. The results, funded privately by the victims' families, provided the most definitive link yet. The DNA profiles found on the evidence strongly supported the theory of Hart's involvement, with the sheriff stating that the results indicated Hart was the perpetrator. Because Hart is deceased and was already acquitted, the case cannot be officially reopened for prosecution. But for many, it provided the final confirmation of his guilt. Camp Scott never reopened after that tragic night in 1977. Today, the land remains private, a silent forest where the remains of the Kiowa unit still stand as a grim memorial to 3 lives taken far too soon. Case number 3, Gary and Linda Haas. On July 26, 2010, Gary Haas and his wife Linda Haas, both 61 years old, set out from their home in Tecumseh, Oklahoma, for a long-awaited summer road trip. The couple, who were high school sweethearts and had recently retired, were headed for the scenic landscapes of Colorado and South Dakota. They were traveling in their 2002 Ford pickup truck, towing a 32-foot Big Sky silver travel trailer. Gary and Linda were experienced travelers who loved the outdoors. This trip was a celebration of their new life of leisure after decades of hard work. Gary as a longtime employee of General Motors and Linda as a dedicated administrative assistant. By July 30, 2010, the couple had reached New Mexico. They stopped at a rest area along Interstate 40 near the town of Santa Rosa. It was at this mundane highway stop that their path crossed with 3 dangerous individuals who had escaped from the Arizona State Prison Kingman just that morning. The escapees were John McCluskey, Tracy Allen Province, and Daniel Renwick. They had been aided by McCluskey's cousin and fiancée, Caslin May Welsh, who had orchestrated the prison break by throwing wire cutters over the fence to the inmates. While the group was on the run and desperate for a new vehicle, they spotted the Haas family's truck and trailer. The fugitives targeted Gary and Linda specifically because their setup offered both reliable transportation and a mobile place to hide from the massive multi-state manhunt already underway. According to later court testimony, John McCluskey and Tracy Province approached the couple at the rest stop. At gunpoint, Gary and Linda were forced back into their own vehicle. The fugitives took control of the truck and drove the terrified couple to a remote, desolate ranch property located off a dirt road in Guadalupe County near the village of Puerto de Luna. What followed was a display of senseless, cold-blooded brutality. Despite Gary and Linda reportedly pleading for their lives and offering no resistance to the demands of their captors, McCluskey led them into their own travel trailer. Once inside, he used a .45 caliber handgun to shoot both Gary and Linda to death. The investigation later revealed that the couple was shot multiple times at close range. After the murders, the fugitives drove the truck and trailer further into the wilderness to a remote area known as the Cercas de la Cueva Ranch. In a calculated attempt to destroy all forensic evidence of their crime, they unhitched the trailer and set it on fire, with Gary and Linda's bodies still inside. The charred, unrecognizable remains of the trailer were discovered by a local rancher on August 4, 2010. The scene was so severely burned that it took several days for forensic investigators to identify the remains using dental records. The discovery intensified the nationwide search for the fugitives. The group had split up following the murders. Daniel Renwick was the first to be caught after a shootout with police in Colorado. Tracy Province was eventually located and arrested in Wyoming after being spotted outside a church. The primary shooter, John McCluskey, and his accomplice, Caslin May Welsh, were finally apprehended on August 19, 2010, at a campsite in Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. A forest ranger had noticed their suspicious behavior and a hidden car, prompting a SWAT team intervention. The legal proceedings that followed were grueling for the surviving Haas family members. Caslin Welsh eventually pleaded guilty and turned state witness, testifying against McCluskey in exchange for a 20-year sentence. She described the murders in horrific detail, claiming that McCluskey had expressed a desire to get a body during their escape and that he showed no remorse after killing the Oklahoma couple. Tracy Province also pleaded guilty to his role in the crimes to avoid a potential death sentence, receiving multiple life terms. In 2013, John McCluskey was found guilty of numerous federal charges, including carjacking resulting in death and the use of a firearm during a crime of violence. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution argued passionately for the death sentence, highlighting the total lack of humanity shown by McCluskey. They detailed how Gary and Linda were innocent retirees who had done everything right. They were cautious, kind, and law-abiding, only to be met with extreme violence at the hands of a man they didn't even know. However, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision on the death sentence, which resulted in McCluskey being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The impact on the Tecumseh community and the Haas family was profound. Gary and Linda were described by friends as the salt of the earth and the glue that held their family together. Their daughter, Leslie Haas, provided emotional victim impact testimony during the trial, speaking of the massive void left by their parents' sudden and violent absence. The case remains one of the most high-profile examples of the dangers posed by prison escapes and the vulnerability of travelers at highway rest stops. Today, Gary and Linda Haas are remembered for the life they built together over 40 years of marriage. Their story serves as a somber chapter in the history of the American West, leading to calls for increased security measures at remote rest areas and stricter protocols for private prison facilities across the United States.
Case number 4. David Schultz and Ellen Matthews. On July 9, 1976, David Schultz, age 25, and his fiancée Ellen Matthews, age 24, left their home in Green Bay, Wisconsin for a weekend camping trip. The young couple was planning to spend their time at the McCaslin Mountain Campground in the town of Silver Cliff, located within Marinette County. David worked as a meter reader for the Wisconsin Public Service Corporation, and Ellen was a dedicated teacher at a local daycare center. They were well-liked in their community and were looking forward to a relaxing break in the dense woods of northern Wisconsin. They arrived at the park in the early afternoon, parked their vehicle, and prepared to set out on a short walk to scout for the perfect spot to pitch their tent. Tragically, they never made it back to their car. When the couple failed to return home or check in with family, a search was launched. On the morning of July 10th, searchers discovered David's body near a trail leading to a clearing. He had been shot through the neck with a .30 caliber rifle from a distance, killed instantly in what appeared to be a sudden and unprovoked attack. The search intensified as investigators looked for Ellen, fearing she had been abducted. Her body was found the following day, roughly 100 yards away from David. Forensic evidence revealed a horrifying ordeal. Ellen had been sexually assaulted and then shot twice, once in the torso and once in the head as she attempted to flee her attacker. The investigation into the double homicide was extensive, but quickly went cold. Despite the recovery of a .30-06 caliber shell casing at the scene and the collection of biological evidence from Ellen's clothing, technology at the time was insufficient to identify a suspect. For decades, the case haunted the residents of Marinette County. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people and followed thousands of leads, but without a direct witness or a confession, the McCaslin Mountain murders remained a mystery. Every year, the local sheriff's department would revisit the files, hoping that the advancement of forensic science would eventually provide the breakthrough the families of David and Ellen so desperately needed. That breakthrough finally arrived more than 40 years later through the power of genetic genealogy. In 2018, the Marinette County Sheriff's Office partnered with Parabon Nanolabs to upload a DNA profile recovered from the 1976 crime scene to public genealogy databases. This process allowed investigators to build a massive family tree based on distant relatives who had uploaded their own DNA for ancestry research. By cross-referencing these leads with public records and birth dates, investigators narrowed their focus to a single family and eventually to one man, Raymond Van Nieuwenhoven, an 82-year-old widower living quietly in the small town of Pound, Wisconsin.
In March 2019, undercover officers followed Van Nieuwenhoven to a local pharmacy and managed to collect a DNA sample from a discarded item he'd used. The lab results were a perfect match to the DNA found on Ellen Mathis's clothing from 1976. On March 14, 2019, nearly 43 years after the murders, police arrived at Van Nieuwenhoven's home to arrest him. Neighbors were shocked. The elderly man was known as a quiet father of 5 and a former local business owner. He had lived a seemingly normal life in the decades following the crime, just miles away from where the murders took place. The trial of Raymond Van Nieuwenhoven began in July 2021. The prosecution laid out a chilling timeline, arguing that Van Nieuwenhoven had been in the woods that day with his rifle and had come across the couple by chance. They described him as a predator who took advantage of the isolation of the forest to commit a crime of opportunity. The defense argued that the DNA evidence only proved sexual contact and not necessarily murder, and they pointed to the defendant's advanced age and lack of a violent criminal record in the intervening years. However, the forensic evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding Van Nieuwenhoven guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing hearing, the families of David and Ellen finally had the chance to speak. They spoke of the decades of what-ifs and the permanent shadow the murders had cast over their lives. David's sister described the agonizing wait for justice and the relief of finally knowing who was responsible for the stolen lives of 2 young people who had their entire future ahead of them. In August 2021, at the age of 84, Raymond Van Nieuwenhoven was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. The closure of the case was a landmark moment for Wisconsin law enforcement, proving that even the coldest cases can be solved with modern technology and persistence. Van Nieuwenhoven did not live long behind bars. He died in a prison infirmary less than a year after his sentencing in June 2022. For the Green Bay community, the resolution of the McCaslin Mountain murders serves as a somber reminder of the resilience of justice. David Schultz and Ellen Mathis are now remembered not just for the tragedy that befell them in the woods, but for the pursuit of truth that never gave up on their memory.
Case number 5. Mary Cooper and Susanna Stoughton. On August 31, 2006, 56-year-old Mary Cooper and her 27-year-old daughter Susanna Stoughton left their home in Seattle for a morning hike in the North Cascades. Mary was a beloved librarian at the Aeolian School, known for her kindness and love of literature, while Susanna was a dedicated environmental educator who shared her mother's passion for the outdoors. The duo was heading to the Pinnacle Lake Trail, a rugged and steep 4-mile round trip within the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. This area is characterized by dense evergreen forests and steep terrain, offering the kind of solitude the mother and daughter often sought on their weekly Thursday hikes. They parked their green Dodge Caravan at the trailhead, roughly 20 miles east of Granite Falls. When they did not return home by that evening, Mary's husband, David Stodden, became concerned and contacted the authorities. He knew the area well and began his own search. On the morning of September 1st, a group of hikers discovered the bodies of Mary and Susanna near the trail's end, close to the edge of Pinnacle Lake. Both women had been shot in the head with a high-caliber firearm. The scene was inexplicable. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and their personal belongings, including wallets and hiking gear, had not been stolen. The double homicide sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest hiking community. The Pinnacle Lake Trail was considered a safe, if challenging, destination. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office launched a massive investigation involving the FBI and the Forest Service. They closed the trail for several weeks to conduct a meticulous search for ballistics, DNA, or any physical evidence that might lead to a suspect. Despite the discovery of a few shell casings, the rugged environment and the lack of witnesses made the task nearly impossible. Because the area is remote and the trailhead is accessed by a long gravel Forest Service road, anyone could have come and gone without being noticed. In the months following the murders, investigators looked into hundreds of leads. They scrutinized Mary and Susanna's personal lives, but found nothing but a history of service and positive relationships. They interviewed other hikers who had been in the area that day, but no one reported seeing anything suspicious or hearing gunshots, which was surprising given the caliber of the weapon used. The investigation eventually pivoted toward the possibility of a random predator, someone who had been lurking in the woods or followed the women up the trail. However, without a clear motive or a forensic match to a known criminal, the case began to grow cold. For years, the primary focus of public and media speculation was Mary's husband, David Stodden. In high-profile unsolved murders, it is common for law enforcement to look closely at family members. David was interviewed multiple times and even took a polygraph test, the results of which were inconclusive. He consistently maintained his innocence and spent the next 2 decades tirelessly advocating for the investigation to remain active, even offering a large reward for information. In 2023, the Snohomish County Cold Case Unit publicly stated that David Stodden was not a suspect, redirecting the public's attention back to the search for an unknown assailant. The mystery took a new turn with the advancement of forensic genealogy, the same technology that solved case number 4. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, detectives began re-examining the biological evidence found at the Pinnacle Lake crime scene. They hoped to find a DNA profile that could be linked to a suspect through public databases. While this process is time-consuming and requires a high-quality sample, it remains the most promising lead in the case. Over the years, several names have been floated by armchair detectives and amateur sleuths, including serial killers active in the region during that era, but none have been officially linked by the sheriff's office. The impact of the Cooper-Stodden murders on the hiking community was permanent. For many, the case destroyed the sense of safety that the wilderness once provided. Warning signs were posted at trailheads, and hikers were encouraged to travel in larger groups. The Aeolian School, where Mary worked, created a memorial garden in her honor, and Susanna's colleagues in the environmental community established scholarships to continue her work in conservation. Their lives were defined by a deep connection to nature, making the fact that they were killed in the place they loved most particularly tragic. As of 2026, the murders of Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden remain unsolved. It is one of the most high-profile cold cases in Washington state history.
The Snohomish County Cold Case Unit continues to review the evidence periodically, banking on the hope that a new witness will come forward or that a DNA match will finally emerge from a genealogy database. The Stodden family continues to hold out hope for justice, emphasizing that the person responsible for such a cold and calculated act is likely still out there. The case stands as a grim reminder that even in the most beautiful and serene environments, danger can appear without warning, leaving a trail of questions that may take decades to answer.
We still have 5 more cases to cover, including some of the most baffling camping disappearances ever recorded. If you aren't already part of our community, subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. You don't want to miss our next investigation, where we uncover the truth behind cases the authorities would rather forget. Also, I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these cases has unsettled you the most so far? I read every single one of your thoughts. Now, let's get back to the list. Case number 6 is one that still keeps investigators up at night. Case number 6, Jeff Hood in Molly LaRue. On September 13, 1990, Jeffrey Hood, who was 26 years old, and his girlfriend Molly LaRue, who was 25, were nearing the end of a lifelong dream. The couple, both originally from Ohio, were through hiking the Appalachian Trail, a grueling 2,100-mile journey that stretches from Georgia to Maine. Jeff was an avid outdoorsman and a former collegiate cross-country runner, while Molly was a dedicated social worker who loved the serenity of the mountains. They had been on the trail for months and were currently traversing the section through Pennsylvania's Cove Mountain just outside the town of Duncannon. As evening approached, they decided to stop for the night at the Thelma Marks Shelter, a small 3-sided wooden structure nestled in a remote, rocky stretch of the trail. What they didn't know was that they were being watched by a man who was already a fugitive from justice. Paul David Cruz, who was 38 years old at the time, was a drifter on the run from a 1986 homicide and robbery in Florida. Cruz had been living off the grid, moving through the wilderness to evade capture for years. He had been lurking in the vicinity of the Thelma Marks shelter, observing hikers from the shadows. When Jeff and Molly arrived and began to set up their gear, Cruz saw them as targets, not just for their supplies, but as a way to continue his life as a fugitive. In the early morning hours of September 14th, while the couple was asleep in their sleeping bags, Paul David Cruz emerged from the darkness. The attack was calculated and extremely violent. According to forensic evidence, Cruz used a .22 caliber rifle to shoot Jeffrey Hood through the neck, killing him instantly while he was still inside the shelter. Molly LaRue witnessed the murder of her partner and was quickly overpowered by Cruz. He bound her hands behind her back using gear from their own backpacks. He then moved her to a location just behind the shelter, where he sexually assaulted her before stabbing her multiple times in the neck and chest. The bodies were discovered later that day by other through hikers who had stopped at the shelter for a break. The discovery sent a wave of terror through the Appalachian Trail community, a place where hikers usually feel a deep sense of brotherhood and safety. The Pennsylvania State Police immediately launched a massive search for the killer, but Cruz had already vanished into the woods. However, he made a critical mistake. He took several items belonging to the couple, including Jeffrey's backpack, his watch, and his hiking boots. The manhunt ended 8 days later. On September 21, 1990, authorities spotted a man matching the suspect's description near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. When police approached him on the Potomac River Bridge, they found Paul David Cruz carrying the murder weapons, the .22 caliber rifle, and the knife, along with the items he had stolen from Jeff and Molly. He was wearing Jeffrey's boots and carrying his backpack. Cruz was taken into custody without a struggle. Investigators were able to definitively identify him through his fingerprints and a distinctive tattoo on his shoulder. Furthermore, DNA evidence later provided an undeniable link between Cruz and the rape and murder of Molly LaRue. The legal proceedings were intense and highly publicized. Throughout the trial, Cruz remained silent, never revealing a motive for the senseless crimes.
The prosecution portrayed him as a cold-blooded predator who had been hunting humans in the woods for years. In 1991, Paul David Cruz was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was initially sentenced to death for the brutality of the killings. However, the case saw a major turn in December 2006 when his death penalty was overturned. He was subsequently resentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Cruz spent the remainder of his life behind bars, taking his secrets with him to the grave. He died in prison on July 6, 2022, at the age of 70. For the families of Jeff and Molly, the decades of legal battles provided a form of justice, but the loss of 2 vibrant young people during what should have been a peaceful journey remains a deep wound. The Thelma Marks shelter, the site of the tragedy, was eventually dismantled by the Appalachian Trail Conference. A new structure, the Cove Mountain Shelter, was built a safe distance away to give hikers a place to rest without being overshadowed by the darkness of the past. The story of Jeff Hood and Molly LaRue is now a staple of trail history, often used as a somber lesson in wilderness vigilance. Their families established the Molly LaRue and Jeff Hood Foundation to support outdoor education, ensuring that their names are associated with the beauty of the trail they loved, rather than the violence they encountered. To this day, hikers passing through Cove Mountain often stop to reflect on the 2 young Ohioans who were just trying to reach the end of the trail, reminding everyone that even in the most beautiful places, we must look out for one another.
Case number 7. Tyler, Sarah, and Lula Schmidt. On July 22, 2022, Tyler Schmidt, who was 42 years old, and his wife Sarah Schmidt, who was also 42, were enjoying a summer camping trip with their 2 children. The family, from Cedar Falls, Iowa, had traveled to Maquoketa Caves State Park, a popular destination known for its stunning limestone caves and scenic hiking trails. Tyler was a principal software engineer, and Sarah was a beloved employee at the Cedar Falls Public Library. Along with them were their 9-year-old son, Arlo, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lula. They were staying in a tent at the park's campground, seeking a peaceful weekend in nature. The tranquility of the park was shattered in the early morning hours. At approximately 6:23 a.m., the Jackson County Sheriff's Office received a 911 call reporting a triple homicide. Law enforcement officers rushed to the scene and made a gruesome discovery inside the Schmidt family's tent. Tyler, Sarah, and young Lula had all been brutally murdered. According to the autopsy reports released later by the Iowa Department of Public Safety, the nature of the attack was incredibly violent. Tyler had been shot and suffered multiple sharp force injuries. Sarah died from multiple sharp force injuries, and 6-year-old Lula had been shot and strangled. In a miracle amidst the horror, the couple's 9-year-old son Arlo was the sole survivor of the attack. While the specific details of how he escaped remain private to protect the young boy, officials confirmed that he was able to flee the tent and find safety. Arlo eventually found another camper and used their phone to alert authorities. He was physically uninjured, but was left to grapple with the unimaginable loss of his entire immediate family in a single morning. As police evacuated the campground and secured the park, they began a desperate search for the perpetrator. They quickly accounted for all registered campers except for one, 23-year-old Anthony Orlando Sherwin, a resident of La Vista, Nebraska, who had been camping at the park with his parents. Sherwin was not known to the Schmidt family, and there was no evidence of any prior interaction or conflict between them. He was described by those who knew him as a quiet young man with no criminal record, making the violence of that morning even more baffling. Later that morning, at approximately 11 a.m., a law enforcement plane spotted a body in a wooded area west of the campground. It was Anthony Sherwin. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Investigators recovered a ghost gun, a homemade, unserialized firearm at the scene, which was determined to be the weapon used in the killings. While Sherwin's parents initially defended their son, claiming he might have sensed trouble and grabbed a gun for safety, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation concluded that all evidence pointed to Sherwin as the sole perpetrator. The motive for the attack remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Investigators spent months combing through Sherwin's digital history, personal relationships, and background, but they could find no clear reason for the murders. There was no manifesto, no history of mental health crises reported to authorities, and no known trigger that explained why he chose to walk into a stranger's tent and execute a family. The tragedy was ultimately classified as a completely random act of violence, a phrase that provided little comfort to the mourning community of Cedar Falls. The impact of the Schmidt family's death was felt far beyond the borders of Iowa. Thousands of people contributed to a GoFundMe for Arlo, raising over $200,000 to support his future in education. In August 2022, the city of Cedar Falls held a celebration of life event at Overman Park, where hundreds gathered to remember Tyler, Sarah, and Lula. Friends and colleagues spoke of Tyler's brilliance and Sarah's kindness, and the community struggled to reconcile the image of the Midwestern family we all would want to be with the violence that took them. The Makokata Caves State Park was closed for several weeks following the murders, as the community and park staff reeled from the tragedy. When it finally reopened, the atmosphere was forever changed. The case stands as a chilling reminder of the unpredictability of human behavior and the vulnerability of those seeking peace in the great outdoors. For Arlo Schmidt, life continues under the care of his extended family, a young boy whose resilience has become a symbol of hope in the wake of a senseless act of darkness.
Case number 8. Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. In the spring of 1996, Julie Ann Williams, who was 24 years old, and Laura Lolly Winans, who was 26, set out for an adventure in the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Julie Ann, known to her friends as Julie, was an accomplished athlete and a geologist from St. Cloud, Minnesota. Lolly was an experienced wilderness guide and backcountry instructor from Unity, Maine. The two were a couple who shared a deep spiritual connection to the wilderness and were looking forward to a week of hiking and bonding in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They arrived at the park in late May, accompanied by Julie's golden retriever, Taj. On May 24, 1996, they began their hike along the Appalachian Trail, eventually moving to a more secluded spot to set up camp. They chose a site near a stream located just off the bridle path and roughly half a mile from the popular Skyland Resort. This location was beautiful, but offered the kind of privacy they preferred. They were last seen alive by other hikers on May 24th and May 25th, appearing happy and at ease in the mountains. However, when the women failed to return home as planned on June 1st, Julie's father contacted the National Park Service to report them missing. The search for Julie and Lolly was immediate and intense. On the evening of June 1, 1996, park rangers discovered their campsite. The scene was devastating. The two women were found inside their tent, their bodies showing signs of a brutal struggle. Both Julie and Lolly had their throats slit. Investigators also discovered that their hands had been bound with duct tape and they had been gagged. Despite the violence of the crime, their dog, Taj, was found wandering nearby, unharmed. The murders were immediately classified as a federal crime since they took place on national park land, bringing in the FBI to lead the investigation. The investigation was plagued by challenges from the start. Because the crime occurred in a remote area during a period of heavy rain, much of the potential physical evidence had been washed away or compromised. The FBI interviewed thousands of people and followed hundreds of leads, but the case remained cold for several years. The nature of the murders, targeting two women in a romantic relationship, led many to believe the crime was a hate crime, adding a layer of fear and urgency to the search for the killer. A breakthrough seemed to arrive in 2002 when the Department of Justice announced the indictment of Daryl David Rice, a Maryland man who was already in prison for an attempted abduction of another female hiker in Shenandoah National Park in 1997. Prosecutors alleged that Rice had a history of targeting women and had made statements expressing a hatred for women and LGBTQ individuals. However, as the trial approached, the case against Rice began to crumble. Forensic technology had advanced, and new DNA testing was performed on the hair and skin samples found at the crime scene.
The results showed that the DNA did not match Darrell Rice. In 2004, all charges against him were dismissed, and the case once again went cold. For nearly 2 decades, the families of Julie and Lolly lived with the agonizing reality that the killer was still at large. However, in June 2024, the FBI made a stunning announcement that finally provided the closure the families had sought for 28 years. Using modern advanced DNA analysis and forensic genealogy, investigators were able to definitively identify the killer as Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a convicted serial rapist from Cleveland, Ohio. Jackson had a long criminal history, including kidnapping, rape, and assault, and he was known to have spent time in the Virginia area during the mid-90s. The investigation revealed that Jackson was a predator who sought out victims in isolated areas. Unfortunately, Walter Leo Jackson Sr. was never brought to trial for the murders of Julie and Lolly. He had died in prison in 2018 while serving time for unrelated crimes. Even though he could not face a judge, the FBI stated that the DNA evidence collected from the 1996 crime scene was a 1 in several billion match to Jackson, leaving no doubt about his guilt. This discovery was a testament to the persistence of the cold case investigators who never stopped working the file. The impact of the Williams and Winans murders on the Shenandoah community and the wider LGBTQ community was profound. For years, the case served as a reminder of the unique vulnerabilities faced by marginalized groups in isolated spaces. Today, Julie and Lolly are remembered for their vibrant spirits and their love for the natural world. A memorial in their honor stands as a place of reflection for hikers, and their story continues to push for increased safety and inclusivity in national parks across the country. Their lives were cut short by an act of senseless hate, but the resolution of their case brings a final, quiet justice to their memory.
Case number 9. Lisa Guerrieri and Brandon Rumbaugh. On October 17, 2003, Lisa Guerrieri, who was 19 years old, and her boyfriend, Brandon Rumbaugh, who was 20, set out from Scottsdale, Arizona to celebrate a major milestone in their relationship. It was their 1-year anniversary, and they wanted to do something special to commemorate the occasion. Initially, the couple had considered a trip to Disneyland, but because they were saving money and discussing a future marriage, they decided on a more low-key romantic plan. They chose to go stargazing in the Arizona desert, recreating the atmosphere of their very first date. Lisa, who had never been camping before, borrowed her mother's brand-new 2000 Ford F-150 pickup truck for the overnight trip, as they planned to sleep in the bed of the truck under the open sky. They drove north to a remote area off Bumblebee Road, located in Yavapai County, just about 2 miles west of Interstate 17. This part of the desert is rugged and isolated, known for its vast views and quiet surroundings. Before they left, Lisa had a final phone conversation with her mother, Paula, at around 6 p.m., telling her that they hadn't reached their destination yet, but were looking forward to the night. That was the last time anyone heard from them. When the couple failed to return home the following morning as promised, and Brandon missed his shift at work, their families knew something was terribly wrong. Paula Guerrieri later described a mother's instinct that hit her the moment Lisa didn't walk through the door. Brandon's friends and family members immediately began a frantic search of the areas where the couple might have parked. On the morning of October 18th, they discovered the white Ford F-150 in a dirt parking area near a secluded campsite. The scene was horrific. Lisa and Brandon were found lying in their sleeping bags in the bed of the truck. Both had been shot in the head at close range. There were no signs of a robbery. Lisa was still wearing her jewelry, and their wallets were found intact, but a video camera they had borrowed from Lisa's mother was missing, although its carrying case had been left behind. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office took charge of the investigation, but they were met with a lack of physical evidence. However, they did find one strange and potentially vital clue: a broken disposable camera lying on the ground about 100 feet from the truck. When investigators developed the film, they found what are believed to be the last photos of the couple alive. One photo showed Lisa and Brandon smiling in the back of the truck, but Lisa's mother later remarked that the smile didn't look right. It looked as though her daughter was scared.
Most bafflingly, the camera contained a photo of a light fixture on the ceiling of an indoor building. To this day, detectives have never been able to identify where that building is or why a photo of its ceiling was on the couple's camera. The investigation, often referred to as the Bumblebee Road murders, quickly went cold. Detectives looked for links to other similar crimes, including the 2004 murders of a couple on a California beach, but no definitive connections were ever made. Over the years, several persons of interest were interviewed and various theories were explored, including the possibility that the couple had been caught in the middle of a drug deal or had simply encountered a random predator in the desert. But none of these leads resulted in an arrest. The lack of a clear motive and the remote nature of the crime scene made the search for the killer feel like looking for a ghost in the desert. In recent years, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office has utilized new forensic technologies to re-examine the evidence. In 2021 and 2022, cold case investigators announced they were using advanced equipment to extract DNA from items found at the scene that were previously untestable in 2003. They have also worked with volunteer investigators to re-interview everyone connected to the case, hoping that the passage of time might have loosened someone's tongue. A $10,000 reward remains active for any information that leads to an arrest, but as of early 2026, the case remains officially unsolved. The impact on the families has been devastating. Lisa's mother, Paula, eventually moved to Washington State to escape the painful memories of Arizona, but she remains a vocal advocate for her daughter and Brandon, constantly appearing in news segments to keep the case in the public eye. She describes Lisa and Brandon not just as victims, but a young couple who were deeply in love and had their entire lives planned out. Brandon was known as a hard-working young man with a bright future, and the loss of both has left a permanent void in the Scottsdale community. As the years pass, the Bumblebee Road murders stand as a somber reminder of the dangers that can exist in the isolation of the desert. The mysterious photo of the light fixture and the missing video camera remain the two biggest question marks in a case filled with shadows. For those who frequent the trails and campsites of Yavapai County, the story of Lisa and Brandon stands as a cautionary tale about the importance of vigilance, even when simply trying to spend a night under the stars. Their families continue to hold on to the hope that one day a DNA match or a final tip will provide the answers they have been waiting for over 2 decades.
Kylan Schulte and Crystal Turner. On August 13, 2021, Kylan Schulte, who was 24 years old, and her wife, Crystal Turner, who was 38, were enjoying the nomadic lifestyle they both loved in the desert landscape of Moab, Utah. The couple had been married for only 4 months and were known in the community as two people who were deeply in love and lived life on their own terms. They often camped in their silver Kia Sorento, moving between various spots in the La Salle Mountains to stay close to nature. Kylan worked at the Moonflower Community Cooperative, a local health food store, while Crystal worked at a nearby McDonald's. They were seasoned campers, but that weekend, something felt different. While out with friends at Woody's Tavern in downtown Moab on the night of August 13th, the couple mentioned something unsettling. They told their friends that a creepy guy had moved his campsite uncomfortably close to theirs. They described him as an intimidating man who made them feel so unsafe that they were planning to move their tent to a new location the following day. Kylan even sent a series of text messages to family and friends, reiterating that if something happened to them, it was because of this strange man at the campsite. Those were the last messages anyone would ever receive from them. When neither Kylan nor Crystal showed up for their respective work shifts on August 15th, their friends and family began a frantic search. On August 18th, a family friend named Cindy Sue Hunter was searching the South Mesa area of the La Salle Mountains when she made a discovery that would haunt the community forever. She found the couple's campsite and nearby, in a creek bed, the bodies of both women. Both Kylan and Crystal had been shot multiple times in their backs, sides, and chests. The scene was chaotic. They were found partially undressed, and it appeared their bodies had been moved from their tent to the creek after the attack. The investigation was immediately complicated by its timing. Just 2 days before the women were reported missing, another high-profile couple, Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, had been involved in a domestic dispute in Moab that was caught on police body cam. Because the 2 cases happened in the same small town at the same time, the internet was flooded with speculation that they were connected. However, the Grand County Sheriff's Office eventually ruled out any link, focusing instead on the creeper the women had described. For months, the case remained cold, leaving the residents of Moab in a state of fear. Investigators looked into over 20 persons of interest, including several men who had been camping in the area. The breakthrough finally came in May 2022. Detectives identified a man named Adam Pinkasevich, who was 45 years old at the time, as the primary suspect. Pinkasevich had worked at the same McDonald's as Crystal Turner, though on a different shift. Coworkers reported that he had an animus toward his colleagues, particularly those in same-sex relationships, and had been reprimanded for aggressive behavior just before the murders. The investigation revealed that Pinkasevich had fled Utah shortly after the bodies were discovered. He didn't even stop to pick up his final paycheck, an act that investigators viewed as a sign of a guilty conscience. He traveled to Waterloo, Iowa, where he eventually took his own life in September 2021. Before his death, he left a suicide note and made a confession to another person, providing specific details about the crime that had never been released to the public, including the fact that he had shot the women while they were inside their tent. In December 2022, the Grand County Sheriff's Office officially closed the case, naming Adam Pinkasevich as the sole perpetrator. They cited ballistics evidence and his own confession as the definitive proof of his guilt. The motive was believed to be a combination of random opportunity and a deep-seated hatred. For Kylan's father, Sean Paul Schulte, who had been a tireless advocate for his daughter, the news provided a form of closure, though he lamented that Pinkasevich would never face a courtroom for his actions. Today, Kylan and Crystal are remembered for the vibrant energy they brought to the Moab community. A memorial at the Moonflower Cooperative serves as a reminder of their lives and the bond they shared. Their story has become a cornerstone of discussions regarding safety for solo and female campers, particularly in remote areas of the American West. The case remains a tragic example of how a mother's instinct or a bad feeling about a stranger should never be ignored, and it highlights the persistence of law enforcement in tracking down a killer even when the trail leads across the country and ends in silence. The stories of Kylan Schulte, Crystal Turner, and the others we've discussed today are more than just cautionary tales. They are a grim reminder that the wilderness, while beautiful, offers no protection against the unpredictability of human nature. These families went into the woods seeking peace, only to be met with the unthinkable. Justice was eventually served in many of these cases, but for others, the answers remain buried in the dirt of remote trails and isolated campgrounds. The one common thread in all of them is the resilience of the families left behind, the people who never stopped fighting for the truth. If you found this deep dive respectful and informative, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue researching these cases and ensuring these victims are never forgotten. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Which of these 10 cases was the most unsettling to you? And do you think the authorities handled the investigations correctly? Let's continue the conversation in the comments below. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and as always, stay safe out there. Thank you for watching.